Minnesota Centuries, the story of the people, places, and events that have made us who we are. Funding for this series is provided by the St. Paul Companies, Minnesota's oldest business corporation, in celebration of its 140th anniversary. Additional funding for Lost Twin Cities was provided by TKDA, engineers, architects, and planners serving governmental and corporate clients since 1910. Knutson Construction Company, meeting customer expectations by providing comprehensive construction services since 1911, and by Lakewood Cemetery, serving the Twin Cities for more than 100 years, celebrating life.
The sound of progress in American cities is, as often as not, the roar of dynamite and the crash of the wrecking ball. This has certainly been true of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which over their relatively brief lives have remade themselves again and again by clearing out old buildings and places to make way for the new. Such destructive work on a reasonable scale is necessary for any city. Cities, after all, are not museums frozen in time. They are living places that need to change and grow in order to survive. But cities in America change and grow with a special destructive speed, often erasing our monuments before we have a chance to appreciate them. As a result, there is in St. Paul and Minneapolis a community of ghosts. Buildings, structures, places, and objects that died of natural causes or from our neglect. They serve as poignant reminders of who we were and what we've become. These ghosts are still visible in photographs and drawings and grainy old films. They also reside in the memories of many Twin Cityans. This is the story of the Lost Twin Cities. Could say that our two cities were born on a train. When the Transcontinental Railroad finally linked tracks from coast to coast, people from all over America could come here, and they did. From the east came the immigrants, the shrewd Yankee developers, and the money. These newcomers mixed their money and ingenuity with the rich natural resources of the region and built the Twin Cities at a remarkable pace. And because so many of these people arrived here in trains, the first place they saw was the train depot. The Union Railroad built St. Paul's first Union Depot in 1881, then rebuilt it 4 years later after a disastrous fire. It looked much like the first depot, but now it had a fancier tower and a skylit interior. Because it was on the river, the depot often flooded. This made many people wish that the new depot would burn too. And in 1913, when a fire did destroy the building, everyone got their wish. Eventually, the third and last Union Depot was built on the same site, with construction beginning in 1917. It was a massive undertaking that involved demolition of several historic buildings and construction of a huge concrete platform to elevate the tracks near the river. Completed in 1923, the depot retained none of its Victorian ancestry. It was now a monument to Beaux-Art classicism. Union Depot's lobby, like so many great city depots, was massive. The concourse to the trains was cavernous. The station was a hive of activity for people heading south on vacations or to do business in the east or to go to war. Trains were at the center of people's lives, and the depots reflected the rapidly growing pace of American life. Today, the depot's huge concourse is closed to the public, but it remains much as it was, in an eerie sense, still echoing its past. Union Depot's classic main building lives on today as an office and restaurant complex. It is perhaps the most dignified survivor of railroad's glory days, and it stands to remind us of the enormous spirit and boundless optimism of the people who came here and built our cities. On Washington Avenue in Minneapolis, the Milwaukee Road Depot also tries to remind us of the important role that railroads played in the development of the Twin Cities. Sadly, the old depot now stands derelict, its iron train shed slowly rusting away, while plans come and go for its renovation. But it wasn't always that way. For in an earlier incarnation, it was the birthplace of a legendary train known as the Hiawatha. It was a 1930s work of art. They called her the Hiawatha after Longfellow's legendary Indian brave, who could shoot an arrow and then outrun it. The Hiawatha wasn't that fast, but at speeds that topped 100 miles per hour, the steam-powered locomotive was fast enough to attract crowds wherever it would run. Railroads everywhere felt they needed faster trains to compete with the automobiles and highways that were becoming a new way of life. The Milwaukee Road introduced the Hiawatha in 1935 as one of the first streamliners in America. It was an overnight sensation. The Hiawatha could streak between Minneapolis and Chicago at speeds twice as fast as normal trains. And as you hurtled down the tracks, you enjoyed a new level of luxury accommodations. The Hiawatha, and later the Olympian Hiawatha, was a hit for years. As air travel became popular, even the interiors were designed to compete with the luxurious cabins of airplanes. And there was something totally new and modern about going to the rear lounge and sitting under the huge sky-top domes. Streamliners like the Hiawatha represented the ultimate evolution of rail transportation. The evolution had started years before, in the 1870s, with the horse cars, and later the great streetcars of the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company. This remarkable system was the masterwork of one man. His name was Thomas Lowry, and thanks to Lowry, the streetcars linked the two cities together and shaped them profoundly for almost 80 years. For years, whether people were going to a ball game or a Rudolph Valentino movie, chances are it was on one of the big yellow streetcars that seemed to go everywhere.
I have a 1916 map that shows, he started this, of course, way back. This is a 1908 car, but he went back into the 19th century with his beginnings. But by 1916, this system went from Stillwater to way west of Lake Minnetonka, and it went from Anoka all the way to Hastings. It was an incredible system of more than 500 miles of track. You could go all over the Twin Cities. In fact, you could go out to Excelsior Amusement Park. That was one of the great draws. That, stood on the shores of Lake Minnetonka for years, just closed a few years ago. All sorts of famous people, I think, went out there, and the Beatles didn't play there, but the Rolling Stones did. A few people remember that. And they always used to crown Miss Minnesota at Excelsior Amusement Park, and people would go out and ride that scary roller coaster and so on. It was wonderful. And then, of course, the other thing is people always went to the state fair on the streetcar. Special state fair cars that you get on downtown and go right to the fair gates. And it was wonderful. All these people all set for a great day at the fair. You really could get around these towns on the streetcar.
But getting around was not what made the transit company thrive. The company didn't make money on fares. The money, instead, was in real estate. A streetcar line increased the value of all the land along the track. Land the transit company wisely purchased. For a time, money could even be made at the far ends of the line, where the company developed their own amusement parks, beginning in 1898 with Wildwood Amusement Park at White Bear Lake. Transit company brochures called Wildwood the Twin Cities' ideal picnic resort. People dined in its fine restaurant, bowled on its 11 alleys, danced and listened to Sunday orchestra concerts. Adults sunbathed on the beach and changed in the elaborate bathhouses, while kids played in the playgrounds. And everyone, kids and adults alike, enjoyed the amusement arcade, the Ferris wheel, and, by the standards of those days, a hair-raising roller coaster. The trains already had turned Lake Minnetonka into a popular resort, but when the transit company added a new streetcar line to reach all the way to Excelsior, Minnetonka became a world-class attraction. People came from everywhere, from St. Louis, Chicago, England, China, and especially the South. They came to escape the summer heat and stay in the fine hotels like the White House and the immense Tonka Bay Hotel. It was there in 1906 that Thomas Lowry made his boldest move yet. He bought the Tonka Bay Hotel, built Big Island Amusement Park, and constructed a fleet of steamships to serve the park.
You know, this is a wonderful streetcar system, or it was, but it did have one unique feature that I don't think was anyplace else in the world, and that was trolley boats, streetcar boats. You know, years ago, this would be back around the teens of the 1920s, I think that was the last time, but for many years before that, they used to ply the waters of Lake Minnetonka, and you'd ride the streetcar from downtown out to the lakeshore, climb aboard the boat, and the boat would then deliver you to your own dock. And this was particularly nice for people who wanted to summer at Lake Minnetonka. They would live in town in the winter and be out there in the summertime.
This is the streetcar steamboat Minnehaha. It's one of 6 streetcar boats that were built in 1906. They were built to be fast express boats to carry people to the shores of Lake Minnetonka. They were owned by the streetcar company. People could come to Excelsior on the streetcar and go anywhere they wished around the lake on the streetcar boats with a transfer. At the boat waiting station, you had an option of either getting on one of the 6 streetcar boats or getting on one of the 3 huge side-wheelers that were used strictly to take people over to Big Island Amusement Park, because it was a spectacular amusement park.
The park was enormous at 65 acres, bigger than today's Valley Fair. It had a zoo, a roller coaster, and something called the Scenic Ride to Yellowstone Park. Its centerpiece was the 200-foot-high electric tower, whose powerful spotlights lit up Lake Minnetonka at night. The tower was actually a water tower, modeled after one in Seville, Spain. It typified the unusual Spanish mission architecture found in the rest of the park. Visitors marveled at the beautiful wooded walkways and settled into the shade that brought instant relief from the noise and heat of the city. There were 4 different picnic pavilions and a music casino where America's March King, John Philip Sousa, once played. Big Island attracted enormous crowds, but not for long. America's economy saw to that.
But in 1907, a financial recession hit the country, which lasted until 1911. So although the park operated from 1907 to 1911, it operated at a financial loss. A small loss at first and an increasing loss as the patronage dwindled because people just couldn't afford to get out there. So in 1911, the park was closed down and eventually dismantled over a period of years. So it's about building a Valley Fair, having it last for 5 years, and then tearing it down.
Today, Big Island Amusement Park is gone. All that remains are chunks of concrete. But you can find a well-preserved reminder of Tom Lowry's great streetcar system, nearly hidden here at the foot of the St. Paul Cathedral.
This is the Selby Avenue streetcar tunnel, which was built in 1907, and it's one of the more interesting fragments of Lost Twin Cities. It was built because the early cable cars that once went through this area had a very difficult time getting up the 16% grade that went up to the top of the Selby Avenue Hill here. And that was a very steep grade by Midwestern standards. Keep in mind a point of comparison, in San Francisco, the steepest grade for the cable cars was 22%. So in order to cut that grade down and make it possible for streetcars to ascend up the hill, they built this tunnel. And I think it was a tourist attraction in the sense that it was well known enough that it appeared on all the popular postcards of the time. The streetcars in the Twin Cities, of course, vanished in the 1950s, and the last streetcar went through this tunnel in 1958, and after that happened, they filled in the upper end of the tunnel, leaving behind only this lower portal that we see here today. I like to think that one day something will be going through this tunnel again, whether it's a streetcar or some other form of transit, I don't know, but someday, maybe if we're lucky, we'll all get to take that ride again.
Thomas Lowry is remembered today as the streetcar man. So great was his influence that when he died on February 6, 1909, city flags flew at half-staff for the first time in history. And later that afternoon, every streetcar in the two cities stopped and remained still for 5 full minutes. Fortunately, Thomas Lowry never saw his streetcars destroyed. But time, the automobile, and not a little chicanery finally killed his magnificent system. The streetcars peaked in 1922 when they carried 226 million passengers. But the fortunes of the transit company began to decline as people fell in love with the automobile. That love affair was interrupted by World War II, when government restrictions on driving virtually forced people to take the streetcars. After the war, the company's owners were optimistic enough to buy 140 new streamlined streetcars. Known as PCCs, these special cars were developed by transit company presidents to help them compete with automobiles. But in 1949, new management took over, and soon the dismantling of Tom Lowry's empire began in earnest. The takeover was led by wealthy New York City financier Charles Green. Almost immediately, Green began plundering the company by discontinuing service and distributing stock dividends to shareholders. Of course, Green was the majority stockholder. Green's heavy-handed tactics so alienated the public that he was ousted 16 months later by yet another management group led by Minneapolis criminal lawyer Fred Ossanna. As it turned out, Ossanna, besides being no friend of streetcars, was a big-time criminal himself. He converted the entire system to buses with the enthusiastic help of General Motors, the builder of those buses. It was over on June 19, 1954, a wet, gloomy day, suitable weather for the end of an era. Ossanna happily mugged for the cameras as he led the streetcars on one last sad run down the tracks. Ossanna sold the newly acquired PCC cars at deep discounts, took huge kickbacks on each sale, and shipped them to Newark, Cleveland, and Mexico City. He sold the older cars and burned them for scrap, taking even more illegal payments. But the criminal lawyer could not hide his own crimes. Ossanna's relationship with noted local gangsters Tommy Banks and Isidore Blumenfeld, better known as Kid Ken, had already attracted feature story attention in the leading national magazine, Collier's. Eventually, Ossanna was convicted for fraud and sent to prison, but the streetcars were gone. Crews had ripped up the tracks from every street in both cities, as many watched, some in ironic locations. For over 50 years, Thomas Lowry and his successors built one of the world's great transit systems. In just 27 months, Charles Green and Fred Ossanna destroyed it.
You know, it was a sad day to some of us when the decision was made that we were going to go strictly buses, because of course General Motors was making great buses, or somebody was making great buses, and of course the highway lobby wanted to pave everything and pave over the tracks, and some somewhat unscrupulous types got a hold of part of the system and sort of sold it off. And you know, it was ironic that so many of the cars lasted for years in cities such as Cleveland and in Mexico City, and I think there's still some running even in New Jersey to this day. And so it was not an obsolete system in any sense of the word. It was just that there was sort of that feeling, why, this is modern, we're going to pave everything over. Interestingly enough, smarter cities, cities that really thought ahead, realized that they should never scrap their transit system, and they kept their tracks and they kept their cars, and now today they're the ones that have light rail transit. We unfortunately have to start from scratch, but after all, the European cities did it after World War II. Why can't we? I hope we can.
As you rode the streetcars around the Twin Cities, you could see the signs of dramatic growth in the sheer size and expense of the buildings. And you could feel in these buildings the intense rivalry between the two cities. Nothing typifies that rivalry better than the story of the city's first great buildings, the West and Ryan Hotels. The story begins again with Thomas Lowry, who convinced Minneapolis business leaders that they needed something every great American city had, a grand hotel. They turned to a millionaire real estate speculator from Cincinnati named Charles West. It was a wise choice. West was getting old. He wanted to leave a monument to himself. He also wanted to do a favor for his favorite nephew, John West, who was running a small restaurant in Minneapolis at the time. In 1881, Charles West agreed to invest in the hotel that was to carry his name. His nephew, John, would be given the job of running it. Completed in 1884 at the corner of 5th and Hennepin, the West truly was a grand hotel. Its equal, one reporter wrote, is not to be found in the world. The accommodations were sumptuous, with 407 guest rooms, including some with private baths, then considered quite a luxury. The West skylit lobby was 4 stories high. The marble columns had been imported from Italy, the crystal chandeliers from Czechoslovakia. The huge Moorish-style dining room felt more like Versailles than Minneapolis. Charles West's hotel became the center of Minneapolis social life. A Kansas City Star columnist wrote that more people there had heard of the West than of any other Twin Cities landmark. Across the river in St. Paul, the West Hotel had not gone unnoticed. An editorial writer for the Pioneer Press worried that the West Hotel
threatens the supremacy of St. Paul as a hotel center. It is necessary,
the writer urged,
to build a big hotel in the latest palatial style.
They did. In 1885, 1 year after the West, the Ryan Hotel opened its doors at the corner of 6th and Robert. A multi-towered Victorian Gothic extravaganza that fairly shouted the Victorian creed, "Too much is not enough." Anything worth doing, from eating to designing a hotel, is worth overdoing. And so the Ryan had no fewer than 23 bracketed balconies, with white sandstone stripes passing through red bricks. The top was the heavy icing on this very rich Victorian cake. Pinnacles, spires, towers, and dormers everywhere. Inside was a spectacular lobby. Stained glass windows surrounded the vaulted ceiling, which was held up by ornate marble columns. The vast iron column dining room was one of the wonders of 19th century St. Paul. The Ryan, too, was a grand hotel. Its 2-story lobby was one of the great rooms in St. Paul history. President Grover Cleveland was just one of its many celebrity guests. But as these grand hotels entered the 20th century, both the Ryan and the West faced stiff competition from newer hotels. The West went into bankruptcy in 1928, was torn down in 1940. Today, its site is still a vacant parking lot. The Ryan lasted a little longer and wasn't demolished until 1962. St. Paul has always been more protective of its landmarks. If the Ryan could have survived just 10 more years, it almost certainly would have been saved and rehabilitated as one of St. Paul's greatest works of Victorian architecture. Three blocks away from the Ryan Hotel at 4th and Minnesota stood the Germania Life Insurance Building. Built in 1890, its massive sandstone and granite construction impressed its customers, which was the whole idea. But the building's most interesting story involved this huge bronze statue known as Germania. Germania enjoyed a life of relative peace until World War I. But the war aroused intense hatred of the Germans, and many patriots in St. Paul aimed that hatred at Germania, calling for her removal. The company's directors reluctantly obliged. On March 3, 1918, workmen tore Germania from her post and lowered her to the street. The magnificent bronze lady was hauled off to a foundry where workers melted her into scrap metal to be used in the war. The statue was gone, and the name followed. Later that year, Germania Life Insurance Company became Guardian Insurance. The building survived until 1970, when it was demolished for the Kellogg Square apartment complex. 10 carved heads mounted on the 4th Street side of Kellogg Square are the only living reminders of this historic building. A short walk from the Germania took you to one of the country's 5 New York life insurance buildings, all built in 1889. The New York architects decided to protest what one critic called the heavy Western look of the city. The result was this light and delicately ornamented building with unique asymmetrical towers. The building also featured these unusual stepped gables, the most original in the country, a company publication boasted. Like almost every insurance building in the late 1800s, the New York Life Building was designed with one purpose: to impress customers with the company's financial strength. That impression started right at the door with this spectacular 45-foot two-story archway. It continued inside with French and Italian marble, and outside where a noted New York sculptor, Auguste Saint-Gaudens, created this beautiful golden eagle. Happily, this 100-year-old bird managed to survive. You can find him perched today at this parking ramp at 4th and Jackson in St. Paul. Across the river at 5th Street and 2nd Avenue, Minneapolis soon had a New York life insurance building too. Much to St. Paul's disgust, the Minneapolis New York Life Building was bigger. It was a massive red building with plenty of Victorian touches. Inside, a light court provided ample light for the many, many lawyers there, attracted by an 8,000-volume law library. The building's centerpiece was this unusual double spiral staircase surrounded by floors and stairways of marble, imported from all over the world. The highlight outside sprouted on the corners of the roof. These 2.5-ton honeysuckles were a feature of the building that was never duplicated. The New York Life Building became a monument. It was, for many years, considered the second most magnificent building in Minneapolis. Because of all the places that best capture the Twin Cities past, no building equaled the grandest, the biggest, the most spectacular building of its time, the Metropolitan Building. The Metropolitan Building overlooked this beautiful pavilion, which stood at the heart of the Gateway District. The ambitious Gateway Pavilion at Hennepin and Washington Avenues was the city's first attempt at urban renewal as it tried to reverse the decline of the district, stave off the gin joints and the flop houses. This noble effort at salvation would fail, and the Met, just blocks away, would become the victim. Originally known as the Guarantee Loan Building, the Met was the dream of Louis Menage, a real estate speculator who poured $1 million into the project. Although it would be Minneapolis's preeminent skyscraper, Minaj would soon regret the investment. He got caught by the Depression of 1893, and financial reverses forced him to flee to South America.
Here in this granite graveyard lie the remains of the late, great Metropolitan Building in Minneapolis. The Metropolitan Building, which was built in 1890 and demolished in 1961, was the grandest, the largest, the most magnificent, the most ornamental building of its period. And its destruction was an unprecedented act of civic vandalism, a kind of legalized looting of the city's architectural heritage. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Metropolitan Building was the dichotomy between its very rough and rugged stone exterior and its very light, delicate glass and iron interior. The lower 3 floors of the building were faced with this very heavy, massive New Hampshire granite, some of which, as you can see here, was carved, much of which was left in kind of a rock-faced, rugged type of appearance. And then the 9 stories above that were a very deeply colored reddish sandstone, often called Lake Superior stone. And that gave the building a sort of a presence on the skyline that was so strong that some people likened it to a small red mountain in the middle of downtown Minneapolis. But once you went through the carved, very ornate entryway, you got into the inside of the building and you saw something completely different. There was no stone, nothing at all rugged about the building. In fact, it was very light, very airy. It was all glass and iron. The floors were glass. There was ironwork around the entire great atrium that occupied the center of the building. It really was like a big piece of stone that had been hollowed out in the middle to reveal this inner core, which was lit from above by a giant skylight. And one of the intriguing features of the building is that around the light court, on all of the floors, were fairly thick, translucent glass floors. And these floors occasioned a good deal of fright in early visitors to the building. They would come up and they'd say, wait a minute, I don't want to walk on a glass floor. That doesn't look very safe. And in fact, the glass was quite thick and very, very safe. There was a good reason for these floors, however. They weren't just aesthetic, although I suspect that was a strong part of why the architects selected them. In this country where the skyscraper was really developed and when we started getting into these very tall office buildings, the light court became a way of providing light. And we forget that in the mid-1880s and late 1880s, electricity was still a new thing and it wasn't being used extensively in commercial uses, office buildings. So when architects started going higher and higher and building these very massive, solid buildings with very large interiors, they had no reliable way of lighting them unless they could bring light in through the center of the building to join up with the light that came through the outer windows. So the light court of the Metropolitan Building was, first and foremost, a functional thing. It wasn't just for looks, although it looked great, no doubt about it. It was there for a reason. The open cage elevators in the Metropolitan Building were a fairly common feature of office buildings at that time. There were a number of other buildings in the Twin Cities that had light courts and had open cage elevators. Under today's safety requirements and other things, it's much more difficult, if not impossible, to build an open cage elevator for all sorts of reasons. They contributed a great deal to the overall feel of that space, to that sense of openness, and I can still remember riding in those elevators as a kid and thinking, boy, this is really exciting to get into this elevator and watch as you go up. And in a sense, it was maybe the predecessor of all these glass elevators that we got for all these yuppie shopping centers in the 1970s and 1980s. But this was the real thing. Another interesting feature of the building was that on the roof was a garden, a rooftop garden, and that was a very popular item, particularly in the 19th century. There was a restaurant below it, and people would come up there at night, and they could dance, listen to music. Lovers, it is said, carved their initials in the soft sandstone parapets of the building. And it also offered spectacular views of the city. It was a 12-story building. It was the highest building in Minneapolis at the time it was built. And people at that time were not used to getting views of their city. This was something relatively new, and at all corners of the building were small towers, and there was a bigger lookout tower on one corner where you could go up this little tower, wind up a staircase, and get a grand view of the city.
There actually had been a major artist who had come here and drawn a picture of the rooftop garden where they served dinner, white tablecloths. This was in the summer, of course, and the waiters and the music and the potted palms. It was quite an elegant place to go back in the 1880s. And this wonderful drawing or painting of it appeared on the cover of Harper's Magazine, which, you know, was one of the great publications of this country. So what I'm saying is that the Metropolitan Building, or as it was then known, the Guarantee Loan, really put Minneapolis on the map. It was one of the first skyscrapers west of Chicago. It was a major attraction.
Now, when the debate over the Met began to develop in the late 1950s, there were plenty of people who were saying, let's just tear this thing down. It's old, it's ugly, it's not really serving any purpose. The owners of the Sheraton, the new Sheraton Hotel that was being built nearby, said they couldn't possibly have a building that was so old, so ugly, like the Metropolitan Building, near their elegant new structure. I should mention that the Sheraton Ritz Hotel has since been demolished after 27 years of undistinguished life. The reason why the Metropolitan Building disappeared has to do with a number of things, but it was basically a victim of age, politics, and perhaps more than anything else, ideology. The Metropolitan Building was in an area of Minneapolis known as a Gateway District, and that entire part of the city, about 40% of the downtown, was slated for destruction in the late 1950s and early 1960s as part of the Gateway Urban Renewal Plan. It was a form of urban clear-cutting. It was the equivalent of what happened to the great pine forests in northern Minnesota at the turn of the century. Nothing was saved. Everything was taken down. The Metropolitan Building, being in that district, really didn't have much of a chance to survive once the decision had been made to clear out that entire area. And there were indeed some buildings in that district that needed to be taken down, that were very old and very dangerous, that were flop houses. But instead of being very selective about what you did, instead of hanging on to the good stuff and getting rid of the old bad stuff, they simply tore down everything. When the Metropolitan Building debate developed, there were also, fortunately, a number of people, some architects, some historians, and many plain, ordinary folks who fought to keep the building standing. They said, look, this is a gorgeous building. It's part of our heritage. Why do you have to tear this down? The building is occupied. It's not in any structural danger of falling down. But those arguments simply didn't prevail. I think the ideology of the time, the ideology of modernism, of newness, of making something else out of the Gateway was so powerful, and the real estate interests involved were so powerful, that the Metropolitan really didn't have a chance.
On December 15th, 1961, the day before the wrecking crews arrived, a reporter interviewed Wally Morotsky, who for 20 years had been the Met's janitor. Wally said he wouldn't be there tomorrow. I'm not going to watch them rip it down, he said. Then Wally became something of a prophet. He said, future generations are going to read about this building, and they'll damn us, they will, for tearing down the Met.
Had the building survived another 10 years into the era of historic preservation laws, it undoubtedly would have been restored. Today it would be full of lawyers and doctors and other people. It would be the center of the city. It would be the great building that everyone would come to see. It would be a tremendous landmark for the city of Minneapolis. And to this day, I think many people feel that when the building was destroyed, part of Minneapolis's heart and soul went with it.
In 1886, Harper's Magazine wrote, "The fascination with baseball has seized the American people, regardless of age, sex, or other condition." Minnesotans were certainly fascinated. They especially loved to see the Twin Cities battle with bats and balls. The Millers against the Saints.
The first downtown ballpark was built in 1889. It was behind the West Hotel on First Avenue North. It's right on the current site of Butler Square across the street from the Target Center. It was a tiny little ballpark, probably no more than 250 feet from home plate down the foul lines. And it meant that in the 1890s, even though this was a period when home runs were not a big part of the game, a lot of home runs were hit, especially by the Millers. In 1895, the Millers' first baseman, Perry Moose Worden, hit 45 home runs, which is hardly an unheard of total today. But it was at that time. It was an organized baseball record and one that stood for 24 years until a fellow by the name of Babe Ruth took up the business of hitting home runs and eventually broke that. In 1896, the Millers had their first pennant winner. They won the Western League pennant, but they did so in a new ballpark because early in the season they were given their eviction notice from Athletic Park. The ground in which the ballpark stood had been sold, and they were given 30 days to find a new place to play. So while the team took off for a road trip to the east, not knowing where their new home would be when they got back to the Twin Cities, they found a brand new wooden ballpark waiting for them on the corner of 31st and Nicollet, just off Lake Street. It eventually became known as Nicollet Park. The Lexington Park opened on the corner of Lexington and University in 1897 and served as the home of the St. Paul Saints until 1956. It opened 1 year after Nicollet Park, closed 1 year after Nicollet, and was in existence for 60 years, just like Nicollet Park.
And as the Twin Cities grew, so too did the rivalry between two of minor league baseball's winningest teams.
The highlights of the rivalry between the Millers and Saints were the holiday doubleheaders. On Decoration Day, the 4th of July, and Labor Day, the teams would play a doubleheader with a morning game at one ballpark, at Lexington Park in St. Paul or at Nicollet Park in Minneapolis, and then the afternoon game would be at the other ballpark. So all the people after attending the morning game would hop the streetcar and follow their heroes across the river into enemy territory for the afternoon game. One of the best remembered games was the morning game of the 4th of July doubleheader in 1929, when a tremendous brawl broke out between the Millers and Saints. The dugouts emptied. It was a brawl that was still being written about 40, 50 years later. And Sammy Bone, a reserve Miller infielder who was not playing in the game but was coaching first base at the time that the brawl broke out, came out of the coaching box to land some of the hardest punches in that fight. And the next day, the headline over Halsey Hall's story in the Minneapolis Journal read, "Sammy Bone doesn't play, but gets more hits than those who do."
Millers and Saints fans saw some of baseball's greatest players. Ted Williams played for the Millers in 1938, his last stop on the way to the Boston Red Sox and the Hall of Fame. 22 years later, they saw another future Hall of Famer, Carl Yastrzemski, on his way to a legendary career with the Red Sox. The Brooklyn Dodgers, who wanted to break the color barrier in the all-white American Association, sent young Roy Campanella to the Saints for a few weeks in 1948 to become the league's first black player. 3 years later, Willie Mays dropped by for a brief and glorious month in May of 1951 when he hit almost 500 for 35 games before the New York Giants summoned him, a move that offended fans so much the Giants ran big ads in the local newspaper trying to explain why Willie was gone. Our baseball teams keep changing homes, but the team destined for more greatness than any of them never had a home. They were the Minneapolis Lakers. From 1948 to 1954, the team won the NBA championship 5 times. The Lakers star was the legendary center George Mikan, the dominant player in the early NBA. In these early days, the game went through some growing pains. There was no limit on fouls, and few were called. The owners thought they slowed up the games too much. George Mikan so dominated the game that in 1950, the Associated Press voted him the greatest basketball player of the half-century. But when Mikan passed the bar in 1954, the team started losing more and the fans started caring less. But in 1959, owner Bob Short made the move that almost saved the franchise. He drafted Elgin Baylor.
I mean, this guy had charisma. He had so much talent. And I remember Johnny Kundla, he and I, we went through that whole period together, our coach, and he said, well, Mickey says, you got to take Elgin under your wing and teach him about this game of pro ball. It's different than college ball. And I said, well, hey, teaching Elgin Baylor how to play basketball is like teaching Picasso how to paint.
That first year, Baylor led the Lakers to the finals. Winning was easy again. It was getting to the games that was hard.
Well, the ultimate reason that the Lakers did move from here in 1960 and 61 was because of a lack of a place to play. I remember Elgin Baylor came late to a game one night, and I said, what happened, Elgin? Did you have car trouble? He says, no. He says, I thought the game was over in St. Paul, and here we were playing in the Minneapolis Armory, and right away, you know, the lights went on. If the players don't know where the game is, how in the world do the fans know?
So in 1960, with the economy and attendance flagging, the Lakers left and the dynasty headed west.
Bob Short, the year after I'd quit, decided to move the team to Los Angeles. And who did they pick up the first year out there but a guy named Jerry West, another one of these superstars. And I've always said that if the team had stayed here one more year, it still would have been here. It would have been the granddaddy of all the major league sports, because in those years, the Twins weren't here yet, the Vikings weren't here, and there was no evidence of anyone, municipal or otherwise, stepping forward and saying, hey, we got to build an arena for this team to play in. A few short years later, not too many years later, they get behind this thing and build a stadium, Metropolitan Stadium, to attract Major League Baseball here. This was the beginning of it.
In the movie Field of Dreams, a man built a baseball park at a cornfield after hearing voices say, build it and they will come. In 1956, it worked in Minnesota when the city built a stadium in Bloomington's cornfields, hoping to attract a major league team. For several years, only the Millers and their fans came. But in 1961, they finally came. The Washington Senators, soon to become the Minnesota Twins, and owner Calvin Griffith. And just 4 years after that, people from all over the world came to see the Twins in their first World Series out there in the cornfields where the team remained for 20 years. Met Stadium became the home for many great memories, especially of Harmon Killebrew and his soaring home runs. And the kings of the frozen tundra, the Minnesota Vikings, came to Metropolitan Stadium too. And the Vikings' fanatical fans came for years and years, bundled in layers against the cold, cheering one of the league's best teams. We built it, and they came. Theaters, especially Orpheum theaters, were everywhere in the early 1900s. Minneapolis has restored its Orpheum, while St. Paul's has changed completely. It wasn't movies that built these theaters. It was a wildly popular entertainment called vaudeville. These huge theaters tell us just how popular vaudeville was. The Orpheum, built 90 years ago, seated 2,000 people. Vaudeville was a colorful mishmash of dancing, singing, and gymnastics, what we later called variety shows. And then came movie madness, and in 1920, a building to match it. Here on 7th and St. Peter in St. Paul, the Capitol Theater. Its extravagant Spanish facade made one expert observe, is it great architecture? No, but that's not the point. It's great theater. Inside, more great theater. A massive lobby with marble staircases leading to a balcony surrounded by velvet drapes. Once you stepped into the theater, the feeling was massive still. The Capitol could hold 2,500 people. This flamboyant Spanish theater, later known as the Paramount, eventually became a small, ordinary playhouse. But while the Capitol was thriving, Minneapolis had to respond, and it did, in a very big way.
Today, when I walked into this magnificently restored Orpheum Theater, I recalled immediately 1946 when I worked at Radio City Theater here in Minneapolis as the assistant balcony captain. Radio City was originally opened in 1928 as the Minnesota Theater, and at that time the 5th largest theater in the entire United States, seating 4,050 people.
The theater's 75-foot high sign used over 10,000 lights. One person worked full-time just changing the light bulbs. The ad said that the lobby alone was bigger than many entire theaters. The theater was pure Hollywood, and it spent money like Hollywood, too.
Sadly, this theater was closed during the 30s as much as it was open, simply because it was too costly to operate and the country generally was going through a depression. The Minnesota Theater finally got over its turbulent times and its complete rebirth in 1944 when it reopened as Radio City Theater and then remained open continuously for the next 15 years. Radio City was the kind of a theater that when you walked in, you were awestruck. The grand lobby with a magnificent staircase at the opposite end just bowled everyone over. Beautiful marble columns, 4 magnificent 12-foot high crystal chandeliers that we lowered by winch to rebulb them. These chandeliers each weighed 2.5 tons. We had a staff of about 60 ushers in white gloves, in starched dickies, in very sharp uniforms. And everything we did at Radio City was done to set it above and apart from every other theater in the Twin Cities. The sound and the presentation were unequaled anywhere. We would change even the lighting depending upon what was on the screen or what was on the stage. We would use a soft blue light in the proscenium during the newsreel.
Another exciting innovation was something called a Magnorama, one more piece of Radio City movie magic. For an important scene, the projectionist could expand the screen to make even more impact.
Radio City, in fact, the first summer that it was open, played a movie with Bing Crosby, and 100,000 people attended the first week. These were the days of Radio City's heyday. These were the peak glory years. It was the golden era of motion pictures, when the crowds were just breaking literally the doors down to get in.
These were the glory days of theaters, so grand that people called them movie palaces. But the glory days were about to end. Something smaller was coming along.
I think Radio City Theater, after 15 years of great operation until 1958, met its demise probably and chiefly because of television. TV, coupled with a change in the way movies were being booked into the major theaters, people were now going to the suburbs to shop, to dine, to see movies.
And so movie palaces, too, faded into the memory of the lost Twin Cities. At every stage of a city's life, we create wonderful things. And happily, we even managed to keep a few of them. We've kept some of our theaters, though perhaps not our greatest ones. These places are treasures because they tell us firsthand and in our own words what life was like back then. And they give to our lives a certain grandeur, something life can always use a little more of. Sometimes it's hard to think that losing our landmarks could ever be considered progress. The loss of those things is a loss. Nothing can bring them back. Places like the West, the Ryan, the Radio City, and perhaps saddest of all, the Metropolitan Building, add to our understanding and our wisdom. And they make life and our view of it a little richer. And sometimes these places and things just fill us with awe, which is a pretty wonderful experience all by itself. We have come a long, wonderful way in these Twin Cities. But perhaps we should have packed a little heavier. We should have brought more of all of this with us.
Funding for the Minnesota Centuries project was provided by the St. Paul Companies, Minnesota's oldest business corporation, in celebration of its 140th anniversary. Additional funding for Lost Twin Cities was provided by TKDA, engineers, architects, and planners serving governmental and corporate clients since 1910, Knutson Construction Company, meeting customer expectations by providing comprehensive construction services since 1911, and by Lakewood Cemetery, serving the Twin Cities for more than 100 years, celebrating life.